I never intended to walk into his house that day. It all started as a simple mistake, an act of neighborly concern. My husband had left early that morning for a business trip, leaving me alone at home. As I spent the day cleaning and scrolling through social media, I suddenly heard a strange noise coming from my neighbor's house around noon. At first I brushed it off as the plumbing acting up, but when the sound, like rushing water, continued, I began to worry. My neighbor, Mr. Bennett, was in his 60s, recently widowed, and living alone. He was a kind, quiet man with an air of dignity. Although my husband and I had exchanged pleasantries with him over the years, we weren't particularly close. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that something might be wrong. And so his front door was slightly open, which made me even more uneasy. I knocked softly and called out, "Mr. Bennett, are you all right?" There was no response. My heart raced as I hesitated at the doorway, torn about stepping inside without permission. But the sound of running water grew louder, and my imagination ran wild. What if he had slipped or needed help? I stepped in cautiously, my heart pounding. The living room was tidy and quiet, carrying a faint scent of aftershave. I followed the sound down the hall, stopping at the bathroom door, which was open just a crack. Steam drifted into the hallway. "Mr. Bennett?" I called again, louder this time. "Good morning." Then I saw him. He was in the shower, his back to me, with water streaming over his shoulders. The mirror was fogged, but I could see enough to feel utterly mortified. Before I could back away, he turned slightly and caught my reflection in the mirror. His eyes widened in surprise, but to my shock, there was no anger, just calmness. He quickly grabbed a towel and wrapped it around his waist as he stepped out. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, my face burning. I heard the water and thought something was wrong. To my surprise, he chuckled, a warm, comforting sound. "No harm done," he said gently. "I should have locked the door. You were just being thoughtful." His response disarmed me completely. Instead of annoyance, he seemed amused. His composure, even as water dripped from his silver hair, made me feel even more flustered. "I'll go now," I mumbled, backing out. As I turned to leave, he said softly, "Wait. Thank you for checking on me. It's nice to know someone cares." His words stayed with me long after I returned home. I told myself it was just a simple moment, a harmless encounter. But deep down, I knew it had left a mark. In the days that followed, I avoided him out of embarrassment, but I couldn't get the image of his calm, kind demeanor out of my mind. One afternoon, as I was trimming bushes in my backyard, his voice startled me. "Whoa. Looks like you've got a green thumb," he said with a smile, leaning on the fence that separated our yards. I laughed nervously. "It's more of a battle than a skill." I replied, He chuckled and leaned closer. "You're doing better than I would. My wife had the talent for gardening. Since she's been gone, I'd let most of it go." His tone softened, and I saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Without thinking, I said, "I could help if you'd like." And that's how it began. Over the next few days, I started spending time in his yard, helping him tame the overgrown plants and neglected flower beds. He joined me, sharing stories about his late wife, his years as a teacher, and the trips he always wanted to take but never got around to. First, it felt like nothing more than two neighbors bonding, but I started noticing the way he looked at me, how his gaze lingered when I laughed, or how his hand would brush against mine as we worked. I couldn't deny the way my heart skipped when it happened. One afternoon, after we'd finished tidying the garden, he handed me a glass of lemonade. Our fingers touched briefly, and I felt a spark, a shift in the air between us. "You've done more for this garden than I have in years," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "It's nothing," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not nothing," he said, his tone steady and sincere. Maybe I just needed someone to remind me how much life there is to enjoy. His words left me speechless. Something had undeniably changed, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. A part of me wanted to pull away, to remind myself that I was married, that this was just an act of neighborly kindness. But another part felt drawn to him, unable to ignore the spark between us. The evening that changed everything was quiet, with rain softly tapping against the windows. My husband had called earlier, saying his trip would be extended by another week. I understood on the phone, but deep down, I felt the growing weight of loneliness pressing on me. And then, I hadn't planned to visit Mr. Bennett that night, but somehow I ended up at his door, holding a plate of cookies I'd baked to distract myself. When he opened the door, his smile was warm, his eyes lighting up with surprise. "For me?" he asked, gesturing to the cookies. "I thought you might like something sweet," I replied, feeling foolish, yet unable to step away. He invited me in, and soon we were sitting in his cozy living room, warmed by the crackling fire. We talked, as we always did, about everything and nothing. But tonight felt different. There was an intimacy in the air, unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. At one point, I set my glass on the coffee table, but it wobbled. He reached out to steady it, and our hands collided. Instead of pulling away, we froze. I looked up to find his eyes on mine, searching, questioning. "You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable," he said quietly, his voice steady but hesitant. She smiled, settling back into herself again. "I'm not uncomfortable," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. It was as if something inside me had given way. He leaned closer, and I didn't move back. The space between us disappeared, and when his lips met mine, the kiss was soft, tentative at first. But it deepened quickly, fueled by months of unspoken longing. I knew it was wrong. Every fiber of my being screamed that this shouldn't be happening, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. Only the way his hands held me, the way his touch made me feel seen, wanted, alive. Time blurred. The rain outside grew heavier, but inside, everything was still, save for the sound of our breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. At one point, he paused, his eyes searching mine, silently giving me a chance to stop. But I didn't. When it was over, we sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. He reached for my hand, his thumb gently brushing against my skin. "I never wanted to complicate your life," he said softly. I didn't know how to respond. My thoughts were a storm of guilt, desire, fear, and exhilaration. I should have felt ashamed, and part of me did. But another part, a part I hadn't realized existed, felt liberated, as though I'd broken free of a cage I hadn't known I was in. Because I stayed longer than I should have that night, leaving only when the rain eased. As I walked back to my house, my heart felt heavy, my mind swirling with questions. What had I done? And why, despite everything, did I want to do it again? The days that followed were a blur of guilt and longing. Every glance at my husband felt like a betrayal, and every quiet moment brought back memories of that night. I told myself it was a mistake, something that would never happen again, but the ache in my chest told me otherwise. At first, Mr. Bennett and I avoided each other, as if pretending it hadn't happened could erase it. But the silence between us was unbearable. One evening, I found myself standing at the fence separating our yards. He was already there, waiting, as if he'd known I would come. "I've been thinking about us," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine. "And I don't want to hurt you or your life." "Neither do I replied, though my voice wavered. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. He sighed, leaning on the fence. I've spent so many years alone, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. But then you came along, and everything changed. He shook his head, searching for the right words. I never expected this. Tears stung my eyes. It's not just you, I said softly. I let this happen. I'm the one who... Oh, don't, he interrupted gently. We're both responsible. But this isn't fair to you or to your husband. His words should have been a relief, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. So what do we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then reached out and took my hand. We move on. We forget this ever happened. Steve began. But forgetting wasn't as easy as saying the words. The tension between us didn't fade, no matter how much we tried to keep our distance. Every accidental meeting, every brief glance, kept the memory alive, leaving me to wonder if moving on was even possible. Every glance felt like reopening an old wound. My husband, unaware of the storm inside me, went about his routine as if nothing had changed, leaving me more alone than ever. His question caught me off guard. For a fleeting moment, I considered telling him the truth, laying everything bare. True to his word, Mr. Bennett began to pull away. He stopped coming to the fence, stopped inviting me over. It hurt more than I expected, but I told myself it was for the best. I turned my focus back to my marriage, trying to repair what I had let falter. Second, yet, every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of him in his yard, and my heart would ache all over again. Months passed, and life slowly regained its rhythm, but the memory of that night never truly left me. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the spaces between my thoughts. I often wondered if he felt the same, if he thought about me the way I thought about him. In the end, there was no closure, no neat resolution, just the quiet acceptance that some choices leave scars, and some connections, no matter how brief, change you forever. So